Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome from what is currently a sunny corner of London, where I'm sat. But welcome to you wherever you are, not even necessarily in this time zone. This is the third event of London Open Research Week 2021. And I think to borrow from the blurb for the week, this series of events has been organised by a group of London-based peers working in the areas of scholarly communications, research data management, librarianship, publishing, and institutional repositories. We decided to collaborate across our institutional boundaries to collectivise our efforts and seek to create something new for Open Access Week this year, which happens this time every year, and try to respond to frustrations we might have experienced with some of what we might consider the poison chalice of openness. And as such, we've worked together to forge a broader type of event for practitioner and researcher communities. And we very much hope that you'll all be able to participate and interact as you see fit throughout the week, and indeed beyond. More of that on the event on Friday. So sign up for that if you haven't already. So as with all the sessions this week, this session is being recorded, including any questions that may be asked. So if you don't consent to being recorded, just use the comment function rather than raising your hand and speaking and identifying yourself. We'll ensure that the questions arising from the chat function are asked anonymously. We'll remind you all that our code of practice, as stated on the website, is in use for this and indeed all the events this year, and we'll apply it throughout the sessions. Now, if you're using the desktop version of Teams, you can turn on live captions for automatic captioning of the presentations, and you do that by clicking on the More Options, the little button with 3 dots, then turn on live captions. And following both talks, which will run one after the other, we'll open up a Q&A session where you can ask questions of Stephen Curry and Andrew Gray. So if you have any questions, remember to raise them in the Q&A session. And I think that's all the admin done. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers. Shortly you'll hear from Dr. Andrew Gray from UCL about how his university's developed a research metrics policy that was responsible and equitable. But first, I'm really pleased to introduce Stephen Curry, who's Professor of Structural Biology, as well as Assistant Provost for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Imperial College London. And as if combining the life of a senior academic with a university-wide responsibility for promoting EDI weren't enough, Professor Curry is also chair of DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment. DORA's vision is to advance practical and robust approaches to research assessment globally and across all scholarly disciplines. So I think Professor Curry is ideally placed to talk to us now on the theme of the intersection between DORA, open scholarship and equity. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Stephen. If you can, let me see, I will share my screen and hopefully everybody can see that now. Right, so it's a great pleasure to be here and to be part of this open research event. I'm going to try and talk just for 15 minutes. My clock has disappeared, but I want Stephen to keep me to time so that we can get to the Q&A, because there are so many complex and intersecting issues around open research, open access, open scholarship, and research assessment, and the issues of EDI, that it's really important to try and get into the conversation about that. But I want to give you a perspective from DORA on that position, and DORA exists and has existed for a number of years now, primarily because of the negative impacts that our obsession with metrics has brought to the academy. And it's exemplified in this case study, which is from a number of years ago, which was an initiative led by the Wellcome Trust, which was to get researchers around the world to share their results on the Zika virus, which in the run-up to the Olympic Games, if you remember, in Rio de Janeiro in 2016, there was a suspicion that Zika virus infection was associated with the occurrence of microcephaly in newborn babies in South America. And what Wellcome realized they needed to do was to suspend the normal operations of scholarly communication in order to tackle a genuine and serious public health crisis. And what that really illustrated was that the way that we incentivize one another in an academic career had taken us into opposition to the public interest. Here there was a very clear public health interest, but of course, this conflict occurs not just in this issue of Zika virus research, but actually across all areas of research where there is a broad public interest. And I think we have to remember that most research actually is publicly funded. About 75% or more of published research is funded by the taxpayer. And in my view, they then have a right to share and to benefit as rapidly as possible from the fruits of those investments. And so we have, I think it's widely recognized, lost our way a bit. It's not the fault of any one actor. It's just the way that the system has developed, and there's a very particular history to that. But one of the people that I've turned to for insight on this is philosopher Michael Sandel, who's a well-known Harvard philosopher, talks about the morality of markets, recently wrote a very interesting book on the tyranny of merit, and gave a really good talk a couple of years ago in London, talking about a new type of politics. But he was reacting and reflecting on the reasons why Britain had voted to leave the European Union and why America had just elected someone called Donald Trump to be their president, and saw it as a type of disenfranchisement due to the influx of the sort of marketization of social life. And he was calling for a return to recognition of the common good, of the public good, and arguing that we needed to frame politics around appreciation of contributions to the common life and collective well-being. And that's an aspiration I think many of us would naturally share, but it has been brought to its knees in a way by the fact that the market seems to run everything. And in academia, we recognize this. So market value in academia is highly metricized. It's coded in university rankings and in journal impact factors, just to give two of the more prominent examples. And these have very significant and powerful effects on culture and behavior. We know that the chase for impact factors slows down publication. That's exactly why Wellcome had to seek to short circuit the normal process in order to advance medical research. And of course, we've seen that behavior propagated through the COVID-19 pandemic to the benefit of the sort of global fight against the virus and the disease. Whether that will carry on post-pandemic is something that will be interesting to see. It creates a positive bias in the literature, which is a phenomenon that's well been known. The metrics drive the hyper-competitive ecosystem in which we now live, and that's really driven because the metrics mean that we focus on the results. We think about the products, although we also think about the inputs as well, because grant income is something that many university researchers are have to obsess about because it's one of their targets in a way. But that leads to devaluing of other important academic activities and the devaluing of academics themselves, because it doesn't really encode appreciation of the diversity of activities that they engage in, like teaching, like departmental citizenship, like mentoring the next generation of researchers. So it provides an excessive focus on the what, not the how or the who. And I think we need to recover our focus on the people who are involved in research, as well as the people who are supposed to be benefiting from that research. And there are many cases. One of the things we know about impact factors is that they correlate very strongly with retraction rates, and there is an issue around reliability and reproducibility in the scientific literature that threatens to undermine public trust. And while the public currently actually holds the scientific community and the research community generally in high regard, that's not a position that we should take for granted. And so we see that the market effects on academic culture are changing the way that academics behave. This is a really excellent paper from Ruth Muller and Sarah de Rijke, recognizing the cultural impacts of metricization. So other norms and criteria for scientific quality, such as originality, long-term progress, societal relevance, social responsibility, they get less attention through their relations to quantitative indicators. And so the obsession with indicators is changing people's behaviors. And you see this in the way that people talk about their research. And these are two real quotations. I've anonymized the individuals to protect them. But, one faculty dean told me, our people know how to get the Nature papers. That's how they talk about, doing really good quality science. Or a postdoc who then told me, I'm really excited, just had a big paper in Cell. The first thing was to tell me the name of the journal, not what they had discovered. And so we see the pernicious effects of this. DORA tries to articulate a broader and more holistic view of what we should value in research. So reliable, rapidly communicated, accessible, i.e. open, high quality research that transforms our understanding of the world, can change it for the better. Researchers who collaborate, who feel a responsibility to the societies of which they're part, and a research system that values the people within it and cares about their quality of life and seeks out the creative vigor of diversity. Now, this is a somewhat utopian vision, I will readily admit, and the challenge for us now, and the challenge for DORA, but also for every university and research institute, is how do we realize this in practice, assuming, and I hope, that most people would buy into this type of vision. And I think one of the real important arguments in this space is to make the case for open science. Oh, sorry, what have I done? I think I'm back in the room. And of course, we've seen tremendous developments, not just in open access, but in the rise of preprints. Of course, in the Zika virus case, which give of course make research immediately available. They encourage peer review, and I do like there is a certain subversive nature to preprints that I greatly appreciate, because they force the reader to focus on the content and not on the container, i.e. the wrapper or the name of the journal that's in there. You have to make your own mind up about whether the science that you're reading about is any good. Open research gives much greater scrutiny because you have a global audience for the research, and that can help to build the reliability of the research record. And of course, the next step on from open access of the papers is sharing data and code and other reagents. And again, by sharing them, you open them up to scrutiny, and we can improve the reliability of the record. And as we've seen with the Zika virus crisis and the coronavirus, then open science is better for changing the world. If it were that easy, we would have done it by now. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate is the fact that you can't really think about, reforming research assessment in isolation, because it does intersect and interact with other movements and for cultural and process change that are ongoing, open scholarship being a primary one, and then of course the increasing recognition of the importance to pay attention to equity, diversity and inclusion within the academy, because at the minute, certainly in this country, we do not have an academy that truly represents the population that it is trying to serve, and that raises questions about the democratic legitimacy of the academy, but also means that the academy is perhaps asking, a narrower range of questions and has a narrower range of concerns than our society who support us would like us to address. And so at these intersections, we see many issues that we have to think about and try and deal with in a systematic way. So at the intersection of open scholarship and research assessment, we have a focus on outputs, and we really need to think, as Dora would say, about the qualities and varieties of outputs. There's a problem focusing too much just on the academic paper as the key output. We do have to think about, what's the real world impact in many cases and questions, and clearly there have been moves to address that. But I think we can certainly do more. In terms of equity and inclusion and open scholarship, it's really about asking questions, who has a say, who gets in, who has the power to shape the research agenda. And I think we need to find ways to be much more inclusive about that, because we have many historical biases and many stereotypes that are still operating to exclude many groups, not least women, but also people from ethnic minorities, for example. But of course, dealing with that is complicated. There are many external and internal drivers that make the world a difficult place in which to operate. We have pressures from governments, and government agendas can change sometimes on a weekly basis. There are tremendous financial and time pressures on universities, and we still cleave to this idea of the sort of genius or hero researcher. And while there have been moves, I think, to better recognize team building as an important skill, or collaboration, I think we're still too much of our incentive structure is centered on the individual. And I think we need to recognize that certainly in science, I appreciate that in some other disciplines, the lone scholar can still thrive and make important contributions, but in modern 21st century science, it's high functioning teams that are really delivering the goods. So DORA is a declaration and an organization that is aiming to help bring about effective reform of research assessment methods. We are perhaps best known, if we are known at all, for being highly critical of the use of the impact factor in research assessment. But in fact, if you read the whole of the declaration, you will see that it has 17 positive recommendations for different stakeholders. And I will, in the interest of time, not go through that and let you read it for yourself. Our history is that we launched in 2013 publicly. We now have over 18,000 individuals and 2,000 organizations who have signed up and committed to the principles. Since 2017, which is when I became chair, we now have financial support. Previously, it was simply run as a voluntary operation out of the back office of the American Society for Cell Biology, which was one of the organizations that was in at the start of DORA. So thanks to that support, and these are the organizations that provide us with funding. The major funding that we have comes from Howard Hughes, the Swiss National Science Foundation, and UKRI. But we also get significant support from these other organizations as well. So now we have a staff of 2.2 full-time equivalents. So we are a very, very small organization, but that staff is supplemented by an international steering group and global advisory board, which in fact we've just reconfigured our governance. So now we actually have a global steering group. So we have one body that looks out and helps to guide DORA in its mission. They are all volunteers. They give their time freely to that mission, as do I. Our current roadmap, although we'll probably be updating it next year, is to spread the word about the initiative and recruit more signatories, extend the global and disciplinary impact of DORA. We recognize DORA was an initiative that was actually very much born within the cell and molecular life sciences, but its mission obviously reaches across all scholarly disciplines. And in particular, rather than just collecting signatories, we want to be there at the forefront of developing and promoting best practice, because it's not enough just to criticize the impact factor. People then turn around and ask you, well, what am I going to do instead? And so we really have in the last few years put a very big focus on trying to help develop those tools, work with other organizations to develop them, and to develop new policies and procedures. So these are just a couple of briefings. I'm going to share my slides actually after the talk, so you hopefully can access all the links that are here. And one of the things that we've done most recently, or this is pre-pandemic, but we've certainly been operating online during the pandemic, but we convened a meeting jointly with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute at the end of October to think about the sort of the barriers to institutional change. Universities are highly complex organizations. They contain academics who have a wide range of views on the business of research assessment and what works and what doesn't. And so out of that, those discussions, which brought together some of the movers and shakers in this space in the United States, we summarized the findings in this paper that was published in eLife last summer, and that sets out a framework for action. So, within any one institution, it's really important to understand the obstacles to change and to take a systemic approach to trying to embed reform. We want to encourage institutions to experiment with different approaches. I don't think there's a silver bullet or a ready-made answer to all of the problems surrounding, how one really does robust research assessment. So we hopefully can encourage universities to experiment. Some of those experiments will not succeed, and that should be okay to fail. That's one of the things that we should be used to in science. But also, it's really important to work with your community to create a shared vision and to communicate that vision, as you go. And I think Andrew will probably speak to that, because that's one of the things that they've done particularly well at UCL. So one of the other resources that we've created and curated on our website is this resource library, which is a variety of policy documents and toolkits that we can promote and share around the world. We, as a small organization, we can increase our impact by collaborating with others. So we worked with Wellcome to help develop their policy on implementing the San Francisco Declaration. And so now I think many people will know that, in fact, Wellcome's funding policy means that they will only fund researchers at institutions that have either signed and implemented DORA or done something equivalent in terms of their processes of research assessment. And that, I think, is getting quite a good deal of purchase, certainly within the UK. And we collaborated with other organizations to prepare a working paper for the Global Research Council, and presented this at a conference last year, identifying really the important role of research funders in helping to drive what we now call responsible research assessment, which is taking a much more holistic look at what we're doing. And finally, one important resource we have is a number of case studies. I'm a great believer in the maxim that nothing succeeds like success, and that if we can point to examples of universities that have taken very seriously the DORA principles and made a very honest effort to try and implement them, and hopefully will be reporting on the results, then those lessons, by transmitting those lessons, we can help inspire others to start out on that road. And one of the case studies that you'll see that has been written up here is University College London, and so that probably is a nice segue then into what Andrew is going to say. So that's all from me, but I'd be very happy to take questions on what I've said and even on some things that I haven't said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And just to remind participants that you can put questions in the chat function, but we'll save responding to the questions until after Andrew's talk right next. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Andrew Gray. He's a librarian who works as the Bibliometric Support Officer at University College London, where he provides guidance and support on the use and interpretation of publication metrics to users right across the university. So his talk now gives us an overview of how UCL developed its policy on the responsible use of metrics, looks at some of the discussions and decisions that came out of those consultations. It's looking at aspects of the policy and how that tries to ensure that where metrics are used, they're used fairly and equitably. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. I should admit up front, I'm not a doctor, sadly.
Oh, well, you know, oh, sorry.
No, it's all right. The joy of academia is that everyone thinks you are, and it's quite embarrassing to admit it. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming today. As we just heard, I'm a librarian working within the university's library services, and my specialisation is supporting the use of bibliometrics, which very often involves telling people, yes, that's a hammer, but this is not a good use for it. This is not the tool you want here. So I'm going to talk a bit today about how UCL developed our policy, what it actually covers, and how approaching the whole question from a perspective of fairness makes sense. So we didn't consciously write the policy with a framing of fairness in mind, but when I started looking at it for this talk, it proved to be a very useful way to think about it. It's striking to note that neither of the major statements on responsible metrics, not DORA, not the Leiden Manifesto, actually use the word fairness, but a recurring theme in both of them has been to try and establish that different research contexts can and should be treated fairly, be treated equitably, by their own merits, and not simply with a one-size-fits-all model. We talk about bad metrics as unfair, we talk about good metrics, good practices, fair and responsible. So first of all, what do? We adopted a policy for the responsible use of bibliometrics in early 2020, after what I tactfully refer to in all of my material as several years of discussion and consultation. We were in fact one of the first UK universities, as I understand it, to look at signing DORA when it was published. So we did what any large institution does, and we set up a committee. That committee, our working group on metrics, is still going strong. So there is ongoing oversight of metrics, but after it had discussed it for a bit, in 2015 we signed DORA, so far so good, and then we realised we had to actually put something into practice beyond saying this is aspirational, this is where we think we are. So unsurprisingly, our early discussions focused heavily around implementing DORA. We brought in some basic rules around journal impact factors, and when we revised our academic careers framework in 2017, we explicitly referred to DORA, and we added language saying that we reject the use of, I think we used the phrase, certain quantitative indicators. Undeniably a good thing, but this is only one aspect of the problem. We wanted to go beyond just having a DORA policy, and there seemed to be a need for a more overarching statement on the responsible use metrics, and not just a don't do that. So at this point, I came into the job, I was given a bundle of drafts and thought, oh, this will be a nice, straightforward job to start off with. We'll get it done quite nice and quickly. So through 2018, we drafted and redrafted a version of the policy, myself and some colleagues, and ran it past some experts, including Stephen Curry, thank you very much. And then we went through a public town hall meeting in the autumn. We cut it down a bit, broke it into a two-page statement of principles and an array of supporting and guidance documents. The idea here was that we could have principles which are well established and we don't expect to change significantly, but the guidance we can develop and refine as time goes on, and we got a better understanding of what was out there. Then we ran a more organised consultation. We spoke to representatives from about half of UCL's academic departments. So this might be heads of department, might be departmental research committees, the one person in the department who has a strong opinion about metrics, wherever was most appropriate. And we asked a couple of key questions. Does it make sense? Would it work? And how do you actually use metrics today? We took this back, we simmered it some more, and then finally we ran a survey of academic staff and indeed non-academic staff as well to gather further feedback. This got a good set of responses, and we were able to put together a final draft. In total, I think we got feedback from maybe 200, 250 people spread across all faculties of the university. So this version, which by this point was the 9th version, went through the formal approval process, and in early 2020, just before the world changed, it became policy with a capital P. 2 years of working on a policy, 6 or 7 years since we first began thinking about it. So a policy with a P, it's great, but what's actually in it? The policy, as we had written it, was ultimately aspirational. It was setting out how we felt things should be, acknowledging we'd not be able to change practice by a central fiat, but it said where we wanted to be, how we wanted to try and get there. It acknowledged existing commitments in DORA and acknowledged the Leiden Manifesto and Metric Tide reports, which had helped shape a lot of our thinking, particularly noting the Metric Tide's position that statements should think about things like robustness, humility, transparency, diversity, and reflexivity, which is a great word and very useful one to think about. And it committed to, as well as the policy, providing guidance and support to actually put it into practice. So it tried to present a more nuanced approach that allowed people to use metrics where they would do so responsibly, sensibly, and thoughtfully. It didn't prohibit, and it didn't require. One thing we've always been at pains to emphasize is that not using metrics was an acceptable decision. If a department wants to say, look, these don't make any sense to us, they're not used in our field, we're going to ignore them, we're happy with that. That's an option we wanted to protect. But once they are on the table, there were some approaches we felt should not be used and some principles that should be followed where they are used. This included drawing a nice clear red line around the impact factor. So it set out 11 principles. 11, well, round numbers are very tempting. It was 10 for a long time, but 11 is what we ended up with, and we resisted the urge to cut it back down. So to run through them very, very quickly, you're of course welcome to go off and read it if you would like. But firstly, we want to say metrics never tell the whole story. There isn't a simple and easy way to measure quality or impact or any of these other words we like. Any quantitative approach, any metrics can only ever be a single indirect proxy. We emphasize the need to consider disciplinary differences and to consider material in its own merits for what it is and not, by some arbitrary standard. And we said that quantitative and qualitative approaches, so peer review and metrics, they both have their place, they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and they should be balanced against each other. But we also, as I noted earlier, committed to saying that metrics shouldn't be imposed where they're not considered normal for the field. We emphasised, in line with DORA, that the work's content is more important than where it was published, or indeed other markers of status like who wrote it. And we noted that some metrics are completely useless, upfront admission, but others are meaningful in some contexts but not others, and they shouldn't be taken out of that context in which they can actually tell us something. We then had two sections which specifically addressed applying metrics to individuals, name checking the H-index, and using journal level metrics such as the impact factor for individual works. We highlighted the need for metrics and benchmarks to be widely accepted and well understood. And we noted that benchmarks shouldn't become targets. If there are benchmarks, treat them as benchmarks and nothing more. And lastly, we noted that these principles, just for the avoidance of doubt, apply to anything else we come up with in the future. We were thinking about the potential growth of altmetrics when we wrote that, but generally speaking, even if we're not thinking of something as a type of bibliometrics now, and it comes up in the future, we want to ensure that we interpret it in the same way. And also that metrics should be calculated using a source that can be traceable, that we can verify and curate it if need be. So 11 points, and there was a little repetition in there. We actually got DORA and its impact factor in twice, just to be sure. And in retrospect, maybe we should have reordered it a little, but anything that's policy with a P is hard to go back and tweak. So returning to the theme of the talk, there are three distinct ways in which we can talk about fairness. One is fairness in interpreting the data, one is fairness in the process of counting, and one, really the most important, is fairness in how we treat people. In terms of interpreting metrics fairly, one approach was to ensure, as I mentioned, that different works were treated appropriately. The metrics that we normally see are very focused around a journal-based model. In fields where the journal is a secondary method of publication, this may not work well, and what is normal or expected for a typical journal article may not make sense in the context of a conference paper or a preprint or a book chapter. The further we get from that idea of a traditional journal article, the less weight perhaps we can place on citation metrics and assumptions on what citation metrics tell us. So it's important to consider like for like, and some things are sui generis. There isn't necessarily a like to compare to. Similarly, it's important to emphasize disciplinary differences. Some fields have higher citations overall. They accrue them at a faster rate, or they may mean citations may simply mean a different thing. Even when a citation broadly means the same thing, having 1 or 10 of 100 or what 100 of them means, that can vary a lot. And of course, in some fields, they may not mean that. Metrics force a particular view of the world. And in some fields, applying them at all simply isn't accepted. The only equitable way to assess research is in those fields is on its own terms, assuming that, as Stephen mentioned, assuming that we can just take the model from the biomedical sciences and apply it to all fields. That's not going to work, and we want to discourage people from feeling it can. After all, if we could have a one-size-fits-all model for citation counting, we could probably replace the entire ref process with a sheet of paper saying give all the money to the particle physicists and be done with it. Probably wouldn't go down so well. So moving on, we also thought about what you might call procedural fairness. So fairness in the way metrics are calculated. The policy said that any quantitative measures should be widely used and easily understood, and any benchmarks should be scrutinised. The impact factor was in our minds when we wrote this. It is certainly widely used, but it's also been widely challenged for being opaquely calculated. Simple calculation is great, but not when you can't quite work out where the numbers come in from. So the Leiden Manifesto summarizes this very succinctly. Simplicity is a virtue because it enhances transparency. And a recurrent phenomenon in bibliometrics is people suggesting new, theoretically more accurate or fair metrics. If we go back to the H-index, which is seductively very simple, if you don't like the way it doesn't take into account the highly cited papers, you could try the mu index, q-squared index, a-index, g-index, or e-index. If you want to remove self-citations, there's the ch index, hs index, and b index. I checked the Handbook of Bibliometric Indicators yesterday. It was published 5 years ago, and it still has 28 pages of these. I gave up trying to count them. The more complex and carefully tweaked the metric is, the more difficult it is for people to engage with it, to understand it, and identify whether it actually reflects what's going on in the real world. And it becomes more likely it's simply used as a black box algorithm to spit out a score. And that way, that's not going to be fair. So we made it clear we wanted people to try and keep using metrics that they could understand. I mean, if they are using metrics at all, that they understood or that our colleagues could understand. Better to have a simple metric with an asterisk on it saying it doesn't work at all in situation A, don't use it, rather than one that involves harmonic means and linear regressions and so forth, and sort of works for A but doesn't have the asterisk anymore, so you think it works for everything, and no one understands, so they don't notice it doesn't work for A, and etc. etc. Similarly with benchmarks, if you're going to say our metric says you have a score of X, but Y is good, you should be able to explain how you got X and how you got Y. What's Y mean? What's it based on? What's a reasonable range, and so on? We should be able to answer those questions before using any kind of benchmark. And lastly, the other aspect of procedural fairness that we committed to is that the underlying data should be controlled and verifiable by the researcher. With the growing uptake of tools like ORCID, we're starting to see the shape of a system where someone can easily and clearly say, yes, I wrote that, not that. The most popular databases now allow researchers a decent amount of control over their publication profiles. And we can try and aim for as fair a system as possible, where you can feel your work is being represented clearly without biases or omissions. In our case, we committed that where possible, we would try and make sure that data would ultimately be traced back to our internal publication database. That's controlled by individual researchers. So we have a way of solving these problems and omissions if they arise. And finally, the reason we're most concerned about fairness in bibliometrics is because we want to be fair to individuals. We have a responsibility to think about metrics that reflect the work people are doing and the significance of that work without being skewed or distorted by other factors. This is true both for individuals and for larger systemic biases across groups. Some of the most popular metrics, seemingly neutral, can embed a lot of assumptions and hidden biases. For example, the H-index, which seemingly allows us to compare the citations of two researchers in the same field, is massively affected by their past career. A short break in publications after the PhD, whether that be for illness, or family commitments, a move to a teaching or clinical role, or whatever else, can cause a distinct skew in the H-index 1 or 2 decades down the line. Indeed, it's a remarkably conservative indicator. It really cares about work done in the past, not so much work done today or yesterday. As your H-index increases, the effect of recent papers diminishes further, and many people would have more or less the same value for their H-index, whether they'd kept working or packed it all in and taken a sabbatical a year ago. In the extreme case, as many people are fond of pointing out, your H-index can continue to increase in time after you've died, a development which traditionally is not held to indicate that you've become a better researcher. We also have a responsibility to think about systemic biases not only in individual metrics, not in citation metrics, but in the pool of citations as a whole. There are substantial systemic biases in who gets cited and in who other researchers choose to cite. So this spills over into the metrics we see. For example, we know that male researchers in most fields tend to get cited more highly than female ones, an effect that is often substantially driven by self-citations. English language material is cited more heavily, so researchers whose work is focused on non-Anglophone audiences may thus be cited less than their colleagues doing similar work in different contexts, and so on. There's a lot of these, we can go into them at great length, but lots of systemic negative biases are out there. And of course, there are systemic positive ones. The rich get richer, for example. Highly cited researchers become more prominent, they're more visible, they get more cited. And at the very simplest level, individuals don't publish that many papers. A statistical outlier that might not have much impact if you're looking at everything from a department or from an institution may be very dominant in the context of a single researcher, whether that be a good paper or a bad one. there's an inevitable element of randomness, and the smaller the set of papers you're looking at, the bigger that element becomes. None of this can really be normalized in any analysis, and so the policy set out clear lines. We said avoid applying metrics to individual researchers, particularly metrics which do not account for individual variation. We go on to individual circumstances. We go on to name check the H-index specifically, but the general principle is that metrics should be treated very carefully for individuals and in many circumstances avoided completely. And finally, I want to touch on the most frequent question that came up in the process. Why go to all this effort to define an acceptable space for metrics? Why allow them at all? Would simply reading and assessing papers on their own merits not be a fairer approach? Many people strongly argued this would simply introduce a different set of biases. Qualitative assessment has its own problems, not least that, personal biases, of course, but leaving those aside, some fields are so specialised that other researchers within the department or a single institution wouldn't easily be able to judge the quality of certain of paper. We're right to be concerned about the biases in metrics, but peer review does have its own biases, and people are legitimately worried about those as well. Several people, when we had the consultation, independently brought this up, saying that they felt it was inherently fairer for a paper to be assessed indirectly through citation by the broader community, rather than directly by one or two people locally who may not be experts in it. In fact, in some fields, there may only be a small handful of people globally who are experts enough to comment on it. Allowing citation metrics to be used where the consensus of the field is that they do normally make sense seemed appropriate. Without that, we're at risk of looping right back to one size fits all, with all the potential unfairnesses that implies. So these are all ways of considering fairness in that metrics context. Fairness in what we measure, fairness in how we build it, and fairness in how we apply it to people. They're all important, all different aspects of the same underlying problem. I think of the three, that sense of procedural fairness is possibly the most tricky. The others are visibly things that people naturally understand we need to watch out for, but the idea that a seemingly better metric might actually make things worse isn't always obvious. So the policy I've written, the policy that myself and my colleagues have written, I hope ensures that we can take these principles, we can carry them forward, but that by being written in broad terms and by referring extensively to additional guidance material that we can develop, it allows us to focus our emphasis on issues that may arise. There are always ways we can improve. Simply having that policy and publishing it won't do the job. It won't ensure that what we want. It's always going to be a work in progress. So thank you very much. I will hand back to Stephen now.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you both, in fact. Yes, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I've got one from the chat already to start off, and I think this is for Stephen initially. Do you have any thoughts on how the ref might look in your ideal world? What would responsible assessment look like at a national level?
That's a very good question, and I wish I had a very good answer for it. I mean, the ref is now yet again under review, so I think it is going to be reconsidered. Its format is going to be reconsidered before it is inflicted upon the sector again. It's true the UK is almost unique in submitting itself to such a intensive sort of bout of self-scrutiny. I think there is merit in it, and actually, as somebody who has campaigned for science funding, the sort of the arguments and the stories that arise from the impact case studies, they do play very well politically, and so I don't think we should necessarily underestimate the political and public support that one wins from that exercise. That said, I mean, I was part of the group that produced the metric tide report that Andrew mentioned, and we were tasked then to see, well, could we make the ref more painless? Could we just do the whole thing with metrics? Okay, that was the brief, and the answer came back pretty loud and clear: no, we can't. Okay, you might be able to do it in some subfields, and in Australia they did try that for a time. But the metrics might work well in the sort of natural sciences to some degree. Certainly if you're comparing them at departmental level and you're just looking at citations, but its behaviours really vary from discipline to discipline, and so a drama department could not be evaluated on its citation metrics in any meaningful sense, for example. And you do need a sort of level playing field for everyone. And it did, the consultations that we ran, peer review has many problems, but people do still place some value in it. I mean, one other example to look at maybe is, so in the Netherlands, they do a thing called the Strategic Evaluation Process, the SEP. And I understand, I don't know the details of it, but I understand that is a lighter touch and less invasive, but is a national benchmarking system that they use. And so I imagine there might be many vice provosts for research around the country who would desperately like to have a lighter touch exercise, but I honestly can't think of a well, I don't have a good idea for good alternatives. I mean, a large part of the scoring obviously is based on an analysis of the papers that are submitted, and that's about 65% of the marks that's given. Research England, who run the exercise, they have long been a signatory of DORA. They've said loud and clear the panels will not consider impact factors of the journals, and nobody believes that they really actually do that. And therefore, when submissions are selected, then attention is paid to that. So, the real difficulty is trying to get people to believe that they really will be judged. I understand that in the 2014 ref, every single Nature paper that was published by a UK researcher in the previous 7 years was submitted to the ref, but I also know that not every Nature paper got a 4-star review. Okay, so one does have to be careful. So the panels do, they do try to take it seriously, but of course they are overwhelmed. I've never sat on a panel myself, but I have talked to panel members, and the volume of work is just astronomical. And so that's why people don't really believe that, they are necessarily reading the paper. So I don't know. I think there's definitely a case for stepping back and thinking, okay, how do we do this robustly, but without torturing ourselves to quite the same extent? But I regrettably, I don't have a good answer to that question.
I wonder, Stephen, if the proportion of the ref scoring that went to the outputs as opposed to, say, the impact area or the research environment, if impact got 65% of the weighting rather than 25%, how that might affect people's views about the venue of publication as opposed to how effective their research was in the widest possible setting in the world. But
I think that's definitely an interesting point that would be worth considering and discussing with the community. The impact score or percentage score did go up between 2014 and 2019. It started at 20% and now it's 25%. And I think that is recognition of the value that universities themselves discovered in compiling their impact case studies the first time around. I mean, I think many universities actually learned about the real world impact of their research. They learned things that they simply didn't know about before. But that did add immensely to the cost of the exercise. So before impact was considered, the ref cost about £65 million. The 2014 ref is reckoned to have cost about £250 million, and that's total person hours across the sector in terms of the effort to produce it. Now, that's a lot of money, and that's a huge increase. Nevertheless, the ref decides on the allocation of something like £12 billion of research spending, the sort of Q stream from Research England. And so as an admin overhead, it's still a lower percentage than the overhead that is exacted by processing project and program grant applications, for example. So it looks expensive, but you have to think about the 6 or 7 year timescale.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. I've got a question now for Andrew. What were the largest or most complicated hurdles in rolling out the responsible metrics policy across UCL, or at least in getting agreement to the policy?
So yeah, just check. Sorry, thought I was muted for a second there. So as I mentioned, we did quite a long and lengthy consultation process speaking to individual departments, and there were certainly some of the things that got there were various aspects of the proposed notes that got pushed back on. One of them was a question, no doubt, dear to Stephen's heart, around to what degree can we make any kind of assessment based on where something is published, and we ended up saying we wanted to hold a line on this. We didn't want things to just be used as a proxy for an impact factor and so on. But it was something that came up quite often because, of course, there is a point at which you say, well, yes, we want to allow people to make some kind of judgment. We want people to be able to say, for example, well, that's clearly just published in some strange predatory journal. You don't want to give that credit. But there was also a lot of discussion I mentioned around the issue of saying, well, metrics bad, peer review good, as a clear binary decision, and people saying, well, actually, is it really the gold standard that we expect it to be in all cases? Can we just assume that peer review is a superior approach, and so on? One thing I also mentioned is that we took the opportunity to ask people what they were doing in terms of metrics. And one thing that we found very interesting there was that I did not hear stories of any of the worst kinds of, impact factor type assessments that we often hear about in institutions, and to what degree that was they're not going on, to what degree that was the heads of department didn't know about them, and to what degree that was they were going on and they knew about them, but they felt embarrassed to tell me about them. I don't know. But as far as we can tell, we set out to find this policy and things didn't actually seem as bad as they might have been. So there was definitely already a sense that people were interested in this. We found, I won't name names or anything, but we found that in some cases where anecdotally you would expect people to be very metrics driven, they were quite metrics skeptical. And in areas where you wouldn't expect people to be thinking about citation metrics at all, people would actually come up and say, well, actually, this is quite interesting. And even if we're not using these now, there are ways in which I can see that this would be interesting to look at and see whether it tells us anything, not necessarily for assessment purposes, of course, but there was a sense that, if we're looking at this data, maybe can this data tell us things, even if our field doesn't want to use them for assessment? Are there things that we can learn by delving into citation data, delving into bibliometric data? So yeah, I think it's still going to be a very long-term plan to get it fully embedded in what we do and in our practices. But we've made a statement and we've got something that we can point to and say, this is what we are hoping you do. We've got something that we've given people a bit of ammunition to point to and say, well, wait, why am I being asked for, the aggregate impact factors of the last 5 papers I've published? A thing I have heard of, but thankfully not at UCL. We've got a thing saying you shouldn't do that. So we've given people a bit of, even if we ourselves have not yet intervened in that because we don't know about it, we've given people a kind of something they can point to and say, this is what the university thinks, and hopefully that will, help them make that position.
And Stephen, could I perhaps ask, did you find similar challenges, maybe resistant, without obviously disclosing any confidences, Imperial, or conversely that there was an appetite to think about these things and act responsibly?
I think it's fair to say that views are mixed, and so certainly that there is resistance. There are some who are comfortable with the status quo, who feel that the journal metrics are meaningful. And should be used as a basis for judgment, and at the same time, then there are many, and perhaps I guess it's more in the younger generation, who are keen to have a more holistic form of assessment. But I think what everybody wants is clarity around what are the criteria that we're using, and that's why this notion of transparency, and why it's really important to have a conversation with your community about the way that you are going to make assessments for hiring or for promotion, because otherwise it just creates anxiety. There is an unspoken rule of the game, which certainly as a young lecturer back in the mid 1990s, I was very well aware of, and for the first 10 or 15 years of my career, I played the game like the best of them. Okay, so but I think there is a view, and I think Andrew's kind of mentioned it. People do think, well, if we use the metrics, then it's a more objective decision. It's less subjective. And I think one has to bear in mind, not only are there biases encoded into citation patterns, for example, but every citation is in and of itself a subjective decision. So I think we have to be completely frank and upfront about the nature of research assessment is a subjective process. It cannot be anything else, okay? Research, scholarship, it's a complex human activity, and decisions around comparing this or that researcher, even if they're working in the same fields, there will be differences and subtleties, differences of approach that will make one or the other, a better person to hire or a better person to promote or whatever. So I think, we do have to be upfront about the subjective nature. We obviously have to tackle biases as best we can, and in part, of course, that's about diversifying the panels and making sure that they are made well aware of the biases that they may be subject to implicitly or explicitly, and the biases that occur in evaluation reports, the way that references are written, for example. There's the whole territory of bias that opens up there. But I think we have to have an honest conversation about these processes. And research evaluation, it's a really important activity. It's really important to do it well, because you want to hire and you do want to promote, the people who are doing the best work. We live in a world that is finite, okay? There's a finite number of jobs, there's a finite amount of money. We have to make decisions. Some people are going to be disappointed. That's the nature of the business. But it's really important to do that as robustly as possible, and to be upfront about the flaws in the process, and to recognize actually there is no perfect process out there for the taking. It's something that we'll probably have to constantly negotiate, because society's demands of us, I think, change and evolve, and we've seen that during the pandemic, for example.
Sure, I think we can squeeze one more question in. Do either of you know, have there been many advances in developing and implementing metrics to track research openness or reproducibility?
Openness, I think there definitely are efforts. I mean, now, of course, one of the things that happened with the last REF, of course, that it was used as a lever to drive open access policy, and so papers were not submissible to the REF unless they had been made open access. And I think a number of research-intensive universities and a number of serious publishers fought tooth and nail for that not to be introduced, but all credit to Research England, they stuck to their guns. So I think now we can report. I mean, I saw a figure posted, Imperial Research is 85% open as of now. I'm hoping that number will creep up and up and up. In terms of evaluating reproducibility, that's much more complex. And we need to distinguish here between replicability and reproducibility. So replication is about repeating an experiment exactly and seeing, do you get the same result. Reproducibility is, I think, a more useful and important notion, but it's what is the work robust enough so that one can build on it, and therefore, because I am a structural biologist, so I solve crystal structures, and in most cases, I would say most crystal structures are solved only once, okay? Because once somebody has solved it, then it's very difficult for someone to come along and publish it. It's not true of all proteins, and if you look at so the coronavirus has stimulated a huge amount of structural work. Most of the proteins have now been solved, or many of them have been solved and analyzed, and there's repeats there. But as long as your individual structure makes biochemical sense and was done carefully enough so that people can use the results, then it's regarded as reproducible. But evaluating that will vary. I don't see how you can put a number on it. It's clearly an important thing to recognize and to try and reward. And I think we do want to try and have a focus on recognizing soundness. And I think one of the unfortunate side effects of the chase for impact factors and of certain glamour journals is that because they're very much looking for exciting and unexpected results, often those unexpected results, because the studies are either not very well done or they are statistically underpowered, and so you get a positive effect that disappears once people actually collect a few more samples. So I think certainly more explicit recognition robustness is important, but quantifying that's again, it's going to be a matter of judgment.
Thank you. I realise we're out of time now. I'm sure we could continue the discussion. I want to thank you both for your really stimulating presentations. Obviously, we'll be sharing the recording of this session. Stephen shared his link to his PowerPoint anyway in the chat, and another participant has shared the details of the Dutch system that Stephen touched upon, which has got an even grander name now, as another approach to research assessment at a national level. So I want to thank you both, and also the participants for some stimulating questions. Excuse me. Remember, we've got another session tomorrow focused on accessibility, and then tomorrow on Friday there's a wrap-up session where we can reflect on what we've heard through the week and think about how we can move that forward in the London area, specifically maybe an open research network building upon activities that are happening or need to happen. But again, I'll thank you all for your time and wish you a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.